Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. Chile is set to have its first elections this month following the 2019 uprising, which was provoked by growing inequality and fueled by a violent and deadly police response. But as the left has made gains, so too has the far right in Chile. Here to break it all down and discuss how it fits into the broader Latin American scene is Renato Vélez, a left-wing Chilean activist and researcher currently completing a PhD in Latin American studies. Renato, welcome.
Thank you, Rania.
I'm so glad to have you on to talk about what is looking like a extremely concerning presidential election that's coming up. So I guess it's the best place to start, Renato, is to begin by talking about the rise of this presidential candidate, José Antonio Kast. He's quite a nasty character. From what I've been reading, he's an open supporter of the dictator Augusto Pinochet, and he suggested digging ditches along the country's border to stop migrants. And he's rising in the polls quite dramatically. And I think he's currently leading in the polls. So can you tell us about this man and about the rise of the far right in Chile that he represents?
Yeah, sure. This is the most concerning development for us. For many people, here, it's like a surprise because many people kind of say that we had the social revolution, the revolt, the uprising. Then we voted for the constitutional convention. Progressive forces have the majority of the convention. They are working, in drafting a new constitution. And the the support for the new constitution was 80% against 20. So how is possible that after that now this guy Mr. Kast is ahead in the polls? And it's not, I mean, it's hard to understand for people from the left how this is happening. But I have this kind of discussion with many friends, and it's like we saw this in the US, and we saw this in Brazil, and the left is doing the very same mistakes the left did in both countries, especially in Brazil. And everybody is doing their part to make this guy president. That's a terrible thing. And like, if you want my explanation of about why he's growing very quickly, I think there's three kind of issues that are important. First of all, is that before the social revolt of 2019, Chilean society was mostly calm, so there was no political instability, and people was accustomed to that. I'm not saying that before the revolt things were fine. That's why there was a revolt in the first place. But you were used to live in a calm way. Chile was like the poster child of democratic governance and market economics, blah blah blah. But what happened in the last 2 years is that just after the revolt came the pandemic, and that of course generated a economic crisis, not just in Chile but globally. And in the case of Chile, government help for the people, like economic aid, was not available until very lately, because there was something like universal basic income, but it became universal just this year. So for most of the time of the pandemic, there was no actual help for the people, and that of course generated a lot of economic concerns. Many people lost their jobs, lost their savings. One of the measures that was approved in parliament, in order to help people, is that your pension funds, your retirement funds, you can take a part of them and use it as you wish. So that's, it's like, instead of government spending money in helping the people, since that was not an option, parliament pushed this idea of take part of your retirement funds and use them like as you like, you know. And the problem with that is that, you know, in Chile we have a totally privatized social security system. So it's not like social security. It do not exist in Chile.
That's like
So
worse
what?
than America. That's I'm sorry. I just want to point out that's worse. I didn't know there was a place that was worse than America
So
in
yeah,
terms of
yeah. So
wow.
actually, what you do is that your retirement money goes to an individual account for you, and there's some private companies that use that money, put it in the financial markets. So they use that money to finance banks, big corporations, etc. And allegedly that generates that, you know, it's the intention is that you will gain, you know, profit. Your pension will be higher because of that kind of financial investments.
Oh
And what
God.
happens in the end is that, you know, people get really shitty pensions
Hmm.
because there is moments in your working life in which you are unemployed, so you don't put money for your personal account in the retirement fund, and that makes that like I will say 80% of the people get a pension which is lower than the minimum wage.
Wow.
Like
Wow.
there is pensions of I don't know, $80 a month, something like that, and
Wow.
that's like the general case. So people in this context said, you know, they said, you know, I don't know, I have a lot of money in my retirement funds, but even so, I will get a shitty pension in the end. So why not taking that money, using it
Hmm.
right now? Because anyway, I will have a shitty pension. So I
Yeah.
don't know. It will be like I don't know, $50 lower if I take that money. I don't care, and that was the judgment most of the people did, and that of course pump a lot of money into the system, and that also like have some sort of impact in prices, because it
Hmm.
was like a big and sudden higher demand of products. It's happening everywhere actually. So not just in Chile, but that's what's happening. So this is issue number one, the economy. So there is
Hmm.
too much economic insecurity. Second issue is immigration. So we used to have like half a million immigrants, like for most of the last 2 decades. And in the last 3 years, we went from that to having 1.5 million immigrants. And of those half a millions are Venezuelans, and most of them came just in the last 3 years after President Piñera went to Cucuta in Colombia, when he was part of this Live Aid concert, when they tried to bring the humanitarian aid, and he said, you know, uh, Venezuelans, you are living, you know, under tyranny. Please come here to my country. We will receive you. We will attend you. We will provide you with everything. And what happened is that most of the people came here. Most of them enter illegally, and there is nothing like properly made to receive them. So there is
Hmm.
like shanty towns of immigrants in some northern cities of Chile, in which they have no services, no healthcare in the middle of a pandemic. They are using public spaces, and that of course create clashes with the locals. And the only person who actually said, you know, because you know the general mood in these countries, we don't want more immigrants because we are not prepared to like receive more. We are under an economic crisis. We are not able to save ourselves. How we can pretend to save others?
Hmm.
And that of course generate different reactions. Some people were criticizing Piñera for promoting uncontrolled immigration in such circumstances, and other people say, you know, immigrants are going to steal your jobs, and they are bringing crime and drugs and etc. We know this speech from other
Yeah.
places. And in that context, Cast rise as a person who has a solution, which is to dig a trench in the border to prevent people from entering the country, which of course will not solve anything. People will cross anyway, they will find a way, but it's a concrete solution. He is offering something concrete. You know, of course it won't work, but anyway. So that's our two things that are like pushing Kast ahead of the polls. And the third issue is the collapse of the right. You know,
Huh.
because we used to have like Chilean political system for the last 30 years was two big coalitions: the center left coalition, which is Socialist Party, the Christian Democrats, which in Chile are considered center left for some reason, uh, and then on the right you have National Renewal, UDI, which is Independent Democratic Union, and other small parties that pretend to be liberal conservatives. They are like the Popular Party of Spain, something like that.
Mm.
And most of them are heirs of Pinochet. Like most of the leadership of those parties were they were ministers or deputies during the Pinochet regime, and among them there was Mr. Kast. Mr. Kast was an MP and a leader of the UDI party, which is the most was the most conservative party in our country. His family descends from landlords who were part of like his base is in Paine, which is near Santiago, near the capital, and his father was responsible allegedly for making lists of people for the military to come in and take them in the first years of the dictatorship. So that's he has of course been a apologist of the dictatorship. At some point he defended somebody called Miguel Krasnov Marchenko, which
Hmm.
was part of he was the son of a Cossack general of the Russian Civil War. So he was a total like a deranged anti-communist. He was one of the biggest torturers of the regime. He has a sentence of 800 years in prisons for crimes against human rights abuses, and Mr. Kass has defended this guy for because he is an old person and blah blah blah. He did it everything for trying to save the country from communism, etc. Now Kass is not like using these issues right now to become more popular. Of course, that's a secondary discussion right now. His focus is immigration, the economy, and the third thing is crime, because
Mm.
like crime has increased a lot in the country during the pandemic years. Is still not as terrible as in other Latin American countries, but for our parameters, the thing is going like really worse. Just for putting an example, the first time I went to Lebanon, the
Mm.
first night I arrived to Lebanon, I hear like machine gun fire and fireworks because of a wedding, and I was like really scared the first time, and then I came back to Chile like the first time and say, oh, I hear like some fireworks and machine gun fire because they were celebrating a wedding, and now honestly I hear like guns and fireworks every night in my house.
Wow.
So there is like a drug gangs and stuff like that is penetrating in different spaces of the country, especially in the capital, and the
Mm.
situation of course is getting out of control. So he is also capitalizing on that, because the left usually propose nothing regarding crime. Left
Mm.
discourse is always we must attack the structural causes of crime, which is economic inequality, poverty, etc. Which is fine. I agree with that. But
Mm.
in the meantime, there is a situation in which crime is going up, and people want some concrete issue to be done, some concrete
Right.
measure to be taken. Oh, there is
Yeah.
another issue I was forgetting about Cast. So as I told you, this guy was from the UDI party, which is part of the governing coalition. But at some point, he broke with the party and created his own party, which is called the Republican Party. How original it is. And and like he's like some sort of I will say he is like Bolsonaro in terms of his proposals, but
Mhm.
as a personality, like his personality is the totally opposite of Trump or Bolsonaro. He is a very calm person. He speaks like very gently and elegantly. He's a very good speaker. Let's say he's pretty good at the debates, better than any other candidate of the offer right now. And so that's I think one of the the key features of this guy is he's a
It
Bolsonaro but in a Chilean way.
he's well, it sounds like he's a more effective Trump or Bolsonaro if he's not as like outrageous in his speech and stuff like that and like says as crazy like offensive things, although that might be part of their appeal. But what strikes
Yeah.
me is how similar what you're talking about sounds to so much of what we're seeing in countries that have these kinds of neoliberal economies that are going through economic crises and the crime rates going up, and there's all these sort of like law and order issues and immigrants. I mean, I think the issue of immigrants is the most striking. And I want to touch on that for a moment because you mentioned how used to have like a very low number of non-Chilean citizens. And I saw this statistic based on Chile's governmental statistics that the number of foreign-born citizens living in Chile more than tripled between 2014 to 2019 and to what you said, which was 1.5 million. So that's a dramatic increase in a very short period of time. And I think it's interesting because many of these migrants are actually fleeing violence and poverty. And you mentioned Venezuela, but also I know there's like some Haitian migrants. I'm not sure how much of the migrant population in Chile they make up, but there are Haitians coming in. But I can't help but notice that these are two countries, Haiti and Venezuela. The reason people are fleeing is because these two countries are suffering from the consequences of US policies. So this strikes me as another consequence of US policy playing out in yet another country. Like it reminds me of, the US did this war on Syria, caused this massive refugee crisis
Yeah.
where refugees flooded into Europe, and it actually changed the politics of Europe and like fueled the far right. Is that kind of what you see happening in Chile with the issue of migrants?
Yeah, but it's sort of. But the problem here is that my like the blame on why this wave of migration happens is not like that here in Chile. So
Mm-hmm.
for the average Chilean, the responsible, like the origin of this crisis is the mismanagement of the Maduro's government.
Of course, yeah,
And
that's
this
what
is
they would say.
talking, and that's a talking point you hear from the far right to the left,
Oh, that's
of
unfortunate because I
and
feel like this is a mistake that the left in the US has always made and other countries is they fail to point out the real culprit. I'm sorry, go ahead. It's very striking the similarities. But so even the left isn't in Chile isn't making the point of like,
yeah, I mean not
okay,
all the left, but the mainstream left,
mhm,
or
or
they blame,
liberals.
yeah, no, but they are progressives,
Okay.
uh,
Okay.
I won't say they're liberals, but they're pretty close to that, but not that liberals. Yeah. So the blame for the migration here in Chile is put, in the case of the Venezuelans, on Maduro. It's not
Mhm.
about the U.S. Sanctions or U.S. meddling. No, it's solely on Maduro. And I must like say also that the people who came here, the Venezuelans who are here, they hate Maduro. Like
Yeah.
that's like a common talking point. And actually, if you go to the streets right now and you are campaigning for a left-wing candidate, they say, "Hey, Chileans, don't hear the proposals of the left because this will turn the country into Venezuela. We are freeing from this. Don't do this to your country. Please be aware of this," and etc. So that's pretty complex actually. And then you have the case of people coming from Haiti, which is
Mhm.
a wave that has been stopped. Let's say it's not happening like at the same rate at it used to be before. And in that case, people blame the United Nations for such.
Wait, what? They blame
So,
the
so
United
they
Nations?
so they blame the United Nations. Our former center left president Bachelet, which is now the UN Rights Commission head.
Right.
They blame her for taking too much people from Haiti, and they allegedly said that George Soros paid her like
Oh,
to bring
Jesus.
18 people to the country. So that's the kind of right wing conspiracy theory bullshit that is going everywhere in social networks, and people believe it. Like
Yeah.
that's the truth of the matter. Like
That's unfortunate. And in Latin America, I mean, you and I have talked about this before with the Latin American right. It's like they always invoke the issue of Venezuela and Cuba. They seem to play for a country like Chile, like Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez and
yeah,
Maduro kind of play the role that Russia and China do in the US, where they're like invoked as like the big boogeymen. Actually,
yeah.
yeah, are is that still
But
happening in Chile? Like, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, totally. They blame Cuba and Venezuela and Russia for the social revolt, and now they blame like there's a big conspiracy that somehow team ups the United Nations, George Soros, and at the same time Maduro and Fidel and Cuba and Nicaragua and Bolivia. So it's like these people have no idea of international relations. They
Yeah.
have no
If
idea what's
only if
actually going.
only
I
if
mean,
only they knew how much money George Soros actually spends trying to overthrow the governments of Cuba and
yeah,
Venezuela.
yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you, going back to the issue of the rise of the far right in Chile. I mean, this is actually something you've been actually warning about this for years. I remember, you and I have known each other for years because you've traveled to Lebanon. That's where I met you. And you've always told me about this far right in Chile that's like fascist. And I found this. I want to read this sentence to you from an article. I think it was like a Guardian article because it reminded me of something that you'd mentioned to me about the Chilean far right. But this sentence says, before the October 2020 referendum on rewriting the Constitution, small marches in Santiago's wealthiest neighborhoods were adorned with U.S. Confederate flags and Make Chile Great Again paraphernalia, as well as a handful of baton wielding demonstrators clad in military helmets. So, what the hell is that about? You have people who actually like wave the Confederate flag in Chile?
Yeah, yeah, and there was even people that went to protest outside the U.S. embassy to support Trump allegations of election fraud. Of course, it's not a lot
Wow.
of people. It's not a lot of
Yeah,
people. That's like small portion of the far right movement. But like,
they exist.
what the fuck, man? It's too much.
So you've
It's too
mentioned to
much.
me, yeah, that's too much. But you've mentioned to me that this presidential candidate Cast is part of this network of far right people across Latin America, and you specifically noted that Steve Bannon has actually helped organize this network. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is a kind of interesting thing that few people knows. There's several like right wing networks operating in Latin America and in Europe, so they are very interconnected. And there is of course Christian conservative groups promoting this kind of networks. There is also something. I think it's called the Atlas Network. I think, which is of
Mm.
right wing libertarians like free market radicals, and there is also something called the Movement, which was organized by Steve Bannon after he left the White House, and at that moment he became friend with Eduardo Bolsonaro, which is the son of Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, and they started making a lot of connections and travels to Spain, to Brazil, to other countries of Latin America, trying to create this network. Uh, so, for instance, Mr. Cast has not met anyone from this network like directly, but he has maintained contacts with Mr. Bolsonaro, with the Vox Party of Spain, and
Oh.
with the Kaczynski's party of Poland. So that's how far his network go. But also that there is like so So they are promoting different figures across Latin America. One of these figures is of course Kast in Chile, but they are putting all their efforts in re-electing Bolsonaro, and they are trying to promote the very same narrative Trump promoted when he lost the election, because every poll shows that Bolsonaro will lose the coming election in Brazil and Lula will come back to power. So they are trying to empower Bolsonaro to claim election fraud, and I must say that even if Bolsonaro is more unpopular than popular now, he still has a big support base. So that's I will say that 1/3 of the Brazilian population is Bolsonarista, and they will support him no matter what he does. Um, and then
Like
you
Trump.
have another figure, which is Javier Milei, which is like a very cringe, economist. You should
Uh-huh.
look at him at YouTube. He is like on cocaine every time. Like like I will say that even Hitler was calmer than him when debating.
Oh my
Like honestly,
God.
and and
Wow.
and he created this libertarian front, right wing libertarian front in Argentina, and now he's like contesting the city of Buenos Aires gubernatorial election, and he's in the third place. I must say that the city of Buenos Aires is always more is more right wing leaning. It's more
Mm,
right leaning, always. Uh, that's the city where Mauricio Macri came like to prominence in Argentina. Uh,
mm,
so this guy Milei is like a radical right wing libertarian, which is
mhm.
also supported by this Steve Bannon Bolsonaro network, and he's now in the third place for the Buenos Aires election, which is like
Jesus.
impressive because he was polling like 2% a year ago, and you saw this in Argentina. They have public primaries, and everybody in Argentina voting is compulsory, so everybody goes and votes in the primaries, and then you see like the center left government right now of Argentina of Mr. Fernandez, they lost a lot of support because of the economic crisis, and I will say also culture wars. Like this is also an issue in Latin America, like these identity issues, etc. And
The
people say,
culture, we call them in America, we call it the culture war.
yeah, exactly, it's the same
Yeah.
thing. So they were promoting like identity politics
Hmm.
topics, which I am not like against it, but they did it during an economic crisis, and a lot of people say, I don't care about pronouns or whatever. I am starving, I need jobs, I need food, I need money,
Yeah.
and that's how like this guy Milei is doing inroads in the popular in the more working class sectors of the Argentinian society.
It's amazing how it's just like one place from another is having the same problem. And again, it just keeps going back to the issue of neoliberalism is really has rotted the economy in all of these countries, and the pandemic made it worse. And then you have the right that's dealing with it, the far right dealing with it as it's always traditionally dealt with it, right, which is by scapegoating immigrants, playing identity politics, um and just using hate to push people
Yeah,
into their camp. And then you have these, unfortunately, you have like the liberals, and then the progressives that don't really end up having as much power, of the liberals not knowing how to respond to it, and then they just end up responding to it in ways that don't work. And I want to actually get to that. I want to get to the problems, like why the left is losing to this guy right now. But first I wanted to ask you how much of this has been a continuation, maybe not a continuation is the right word, but how much of this is related to the Pinochet era. And what I mean by that is, in the US, we know that Washington supported the 1973 coup in Chile against Salvador Allende that installed Pinochet to power and led to a fascist dictatorship in your country until 1990. Is there ever any accountability, though, for the crimes under Pinochet? And based on that, are there politicians today that remain in positions of power from that era? And is there any nostalgia for that era, the same way that, for example, you see in Brazil with Bolsonaro having nostalgia for their military dictatorship?
Yeah, of course there is. Like one of the first issues that came after the end of the dictatorship is that the transition to democracy in this country was mediated by the Americans. You know, this transition was designed in a way that everybody uh, can come to that term. So Pinochet remained as chief commander of the armed forces until 1996. So he still has a say in Chile, even not being like dictator. He always like make his moves when his interests were touched by the civilian government. Uh, Part of that agreement was also that the center-left coalition, who took power after Pinochet, will not touch the key pillars of the neoliberal economic uh, project that was launched by Pinochet. So that was not touched by the center left government that came after Pinochet, and also the political order that was established by Pinochet remained, and that's why we are changing the constitution now. So that's why, you know, uh, and I must say also that in the referendum that kicked out Pinochet out of power, he lost, but he earned 43% of the vote. So that means that a very big size of the accessible part of the population supported Pinochet, even knowing everything that happened, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of support base, which is old people that has nostalgia for the dictatorship, exists. But there is also a phenomenon that I am seeing every year, since I do classes, etc., that is younger people who did not live under Pinochet, that many of them have no relation or no interest in politics until very recently, and they are supporting Mr. Kast, and they are praising Pinochet, and they are doing memes, praising Pinochet and making fun of the helicopter jokes about Pinochet throwing people out of the
Yeah.
helicopters, etc. So that's an issue that's happening here. Of course, it's not as massive as you will imagine, but it's not a minor phenomenon. This is actually growing in a part of in a one sector of the population.
I mean, that's interesting. And I guess it kind of makes sense. You said the Americans mediated it, which how is that even allowed to happen?
Yeah.
But also in the sense that, like, after you have a fascist dictatorship that just executes masses of leftists, it's like, who's going to be left? It's not surprising that you
Yeah.
had a lot of people still supporting him because he didn't kill his supporters. He killed the people who didn't support him. But then I mean, what you say also makes sense to why the left in Chile has maybe been so weak. Since the end of the dictatorship, if they weren't ever allowed to touch the pillars of the free market economy and the government that he set up. And that kind of brings us to the issue of the left. So you have this candidate that's running against Kast, who until recently was expected to actually win the presidency, and that's Gabriel Boric. I think you say it
Yeah.
differently. It's
Gabriel
Boric.
Boric. Yeah.
Gabriel Boric.
He's
Where's
he's
that?
Croat.
Where's that?
He's a
I was gonna
Croat.
say that
Yeah.
sounds okay. So he's Croatian. So Gabriel Boric is the candidate. He's like the left candidate
Yeah.
that's running against this right wing guy, and he's now falling in the polls. So can you tell our listeners and viewers, who is he? Do you think he still has a chance of winning? And if yes or no, can you explain why?
I think first of all, I think he still has a chance of winning,
That's
but
good to hear.
it's a big if, you know,
Mhm.
because first thing people should know about Boric is that he was a student leader during the 2011 and 2012 protest which were like the prequel for the social revolt of 2019. And he was head of the University of Chile Student Federation, which is the most important one in the country. Then he ran as independent for a seat in the deputies chamber. He was selected twice, and then he, with other people who were not part of the traditional left, I must say, people who were not from the Communist Party or the Humanist Party, they started creating a movement, which was called autonomous left. Then then there was a lot of like makeup, breakups, and mixing of different organizations, and then emerged something called Frente Amplio, like a broad front, like a wide front. I don't know how to translate it, which was a coalition of liberal to left-wing parties. So in that coalition that was formed in 2017, you have people from the Liberal Party. There is a Liberal Party in Chile, which is like the type of, I don't know, like Kamala Harris type of Liberal Party, let's say. And and in the same coalition, you have people from Equality Party, which is a Bolivarian anti-imperialist left-wing party on the other side, and they all coexist together during a certain time. Uh, and they pushed the candidacy of a journalist named Beatriz Sanchez, a woman. She got 20% of the vote in that presidential election, which was like a surprise for everyone. The Broad Front got a lot of MPs elected for the chamber, which was also a surprise, and that was like I will say that's the base for what happened later. And the problem is that later, in time, this coalition start to divide itself. Like liberals left the coalition, then people from the left uh, went out, and Boric was one of the remaining figures of the coalition. There is like two main figures in the Broad Front coalition. One is Gabriel Boric, and the other one is Giorgio Jackson, which is from another party called Democratic Revolution, which is like let's say it's like the Democratic Socialists of America. Like
Okay.
that's a kind of. I think they are actually like they have official relations with them. I don't know exactly, but so those are the two main figures of the Broad Front. And what happened is that during the social revolt, the Broad Front split it again among people who wanted a constitutional assembly properly and a constitutional convention, which still, you have people elected to write a new constitution, but has a lot of like limitations imposed by the law that enable this to happen. So some people rejected the agreement that enabled this constitutional process to happen because it was not enough for them, and they left. And Boric was in a party, in a political party that did not support the agreement, but he supported it as an individual. And that, of course, created another split, and things that usually happens in the left. We
Yeah.
have this tendency of splitting apart, and and then what happened is that for the conventional elections, to elect these people, the Broad Front of Boric made an alliance with another bloc which was led by the Communist Party, and they became the biggest force of the opposition in the Constitutional Convention. Because the government, like the officialist parties, they didn't even get like 1/3 of the seats of the Constitutional Convention. So now, like the center left, the left, and the far left have the chance to come together and push things through the convention. And immediately after that, the communists and the Broad Front agree on a primary for the presidential elections. There was two candidates there. One was Daniel Hadwe, which was the
Hmm.
front runner in every poll. He was the front runner. He was a mayor of a popular neighborhood in Santiago. He became a front runner because of concrete policies he enacted in his district, low cost drugs and I don't know, affordable housing for the people, like concrete measures that work, and people
Yeah.
like value that because in Chile there is a lot of anti-communism, inherited from the Pinochet times. But even so, he managed to become a very popular figure in Chile, Mr. Hadwe. And what happened is that the primary began, and I supported Hadwe. Just I'm not an impartial observer here, but
It's okay. Neither are we at Breakthrough News. We're
yeah,
not.
but but even so, I kind of think that he missed the opportunity of self-made mistakes. So there
Mm,
was problems in the campaign design,
I
in,
see.
in his approach to the media. He was too confrontational with the media at the debates, and at the same time, he was too friendly with Boric. And in a debate, you want to stress your differences. You don't want to stress your like similarities.
Mm,
People will choose you, you know, and not the other person. And
right.
he made that mistake. And Boric
He should
did
have
not play
he
that.
should have hired you as a consultant.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And 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 what happened in the end is that also another mistake Hadwe made is that he presented a 225 pages uh, government program that
Hmm.
it was
Too
presented
long.
very quickly, too much, and honestly, I didn't believe he actually knew everything that was in the program. So the right
Interesting.
wing and the media start to look at for the most you know controversial parts of the program, and he was not able to give proper answers. And that
Hmm.
I think it was, as I said, it was a self-made mistake. And then in the last week of the primary, there was this right-wing riots in Cuba.
Ah, that's
So the
when the
media,
primary was.
yeah, and
Okay.
then came the discussion about Cuba is a dictatorship. What about human rights? And then you have the issue with Mr. Boric, that he is like very pretty much the champion of human rights. So he
Mm.
will denounce human rights everywhere and anywhere, and so he condemns Cuba, he condemns Venezuela, he condemns Nicaragua, he
Uh,
condemns China, he condemns Israel too. But nobody asks about Israel.
mm,
They always ask you about Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, and he is pretty quick to condemn that. And another factor, which I think it made no harm for Hadwe, but was part of the media campaign, was accusing him of being an anti-Semite. So they play the same card as they did against Jeremy Corbyn in the UK. So they
yeah.
said because he was part of the PFLP in his youth, so there's and he
Good
has
guy.
never been he was never he never apologized for being defender of the Palestinian cause. He is Palestinian and has every right to support the Palestinian cause. So
Mm,
what's the problem with that? So they start saying no, he was an anti-Semite, and they went so far as to look at for his annuary of high school,
mhm.
the book with the description of the class of that year, and there was like some anti-Semitic jokes in his
Oh,
description that were made by his fellows, not by him, and they used that to say, he has the seed of hate since he was a young person. He hates Jews and blah 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 and etc. Um, so all these factors played against Hadwe, and also there was right wing people and people from the center left that went and voted in the primary for Boric to get rid of Hadwe, and that's
mm,
how he won the primary. But I will say mostly it was to Hadwe's mistakes, but there was also this outside intervention from other political sectors to get rid of Hadwe. So after that, Boric was doing a very good performance at the polls. He was polling between 25 and 30% in every poll since since the primary, and then happens in the last month that uh, we have the immigration riots in the north. There was this there was the cast there was cast rising in the polls, and at the same time Boric made a lot of mistakes in some interviews, like not knowing like certain numbers about the economic numbers, etc. So he was presented as something which has no preparation, no
Mhm.
skills, no knowledge on the economy, and how are you going to run a country which is in an economic crisis if you don't know anything about the economy, etc. You know, and there was some declarations like pretty stupid by a person called Sebastian De Polo, which is of one of the broad front parties, and he said, because Boric has said in his campaign that if you don't want more political instability, we must do the changes that the society needs, because if you don't make those changes, instability will continue. And of
Okay.
course I agree with that, that's fine. But then this guy, which is part of the campaign staff of Boric, said in an interview with the right-wing newspaper, he said, no, we will generate instability in the country because we are doing we will do the right changes. And it's like, I mean, yeah, of course there will be instability if changes are pushed, but you are not going to say that in an interview with a right-wing newspaper. That's the
That's funny.
problem.
Yeah.
And all these things sum up, and since then Boric has been falling in the polls, but it's not that big. It's not a big fall. The problem is that the right-wing candidate, the far right candidate, is going up, because there was another right-wing candidate, and the problem with the other guy is that he was not a professional politician. His name is Sebastian Sichel, and I will say that his entire history is a fraud. He even changed his surname. So he's like an entire fraud, and he was promoted by big business. Like,
Mhm.
he is, the number one recipient of money for campaigning, from big economic groups, because he was trying to say, I support neoliberal economics, but I am also in favor of gay marriage and abortion. And then he presented himself as an incoherent centrist, and and people don't want something like that in this moment.
Yeah,
People
they don't
want a
want a Joe
sharp,
Biden.
they want sharp, they want radical proposal, no matter if from the right or from the left, but something radical and sharp. And and and, and he was not delivering that. So then
Yeah.
people from the right wing coalition start jumping ship and joining Cast, because he was more like an electable person. And something they have been doing right now, people you know people from the official coalition that went to the far right, they have been asking public universities for to make list of the professors at the universities, and they specifically ask which topics they teach at the university. They want to know which people is teaching about gender studies, gender ideology, I don't know, social movements, social history, etc. And they are like asking university staff to make this list about who is teaching and what is teaching. And I honestly fear that this will be for, you know, if Cas goes is elected, they will start expelling people from the university, or I don't know. It's too strange that this is happening right now.
That's really frightening. I was gonna ask you about that if you fear for your own, like, livelihood in this situation, because you had mentioned to me that they were making lists of, like, basically leftists at universities,
Yeah,
and that could definitely impact you. So I hope this guy doesn't win. I guess we'll have to wait and see. We'll know soon.
yeah,
I think the elections are coming. By the time this comes out, it'll be like a week later or 2 weeks
yeah.
later, there'll be
Two
elections.
weeks from
Uh,
now.
Yeah, 2 weeks from now, the day we're recording this, which is November 8th. But I wanted to ask you about the protests. Um, you know, these are, like I mentioned in the opening, these are the first elections that will be taking place following the 2019 protests against that growing inequality that you talked about, and you were very much participating in that.
Yeah.
And the authorities acted very brutally. I remember, and from what I understand, they killed over 30 people, they injured thousands. They intentionally shot people in the eyes with rubber bullets, blinding many people. Um, and you kind of talked about what prompted these protests. And I'm curious, protests have exploded intermittently since then, largely in response to police violence, which of course has continued. But what has been, I guess, the accomplishments of those protests? You mentioned this constitutional referendum or this constitutional rewriting. Is that one of the accomplishments? And what else is there that these protests have accomplished since they began a couple of years ago?
Yeah. So I am very pessimistic about this. I think the
Mm,
only like gain we got from this protest is the constitutional process with all its limitation, but it's the only thing we get from that. And one of the issues is that the pandemic demobilized the people.
mm,
So that of course was a big demobilizer because actually I was in Beirut in
I,
March 2020, and at that moment there was an upsurge of the protest again, because the protest started in October 2019.
mhm,
Then there is summer vacations, and then March is when students go back to school, and people start to work again after the holidays. and
mm,
um, and there was like an upsurge in protest, and there was even like the senate some senators ordered a report to establish how they can remove the president if he is mentally unfit to stay in the office. So that's what like the kind of situation we had right before the pandemic.
mm,
So the next week after that, the pandemic came and everything went down. Like the mass mobilizations were shut down. There was no, and people start like the very people that call for protest say, we must remain at home, we must protect our families, etc. Then there was like rallies. I won't say protest rallies uh, in very big numbers for the first anniversary of the revolt, and that was a week before the referendum that enabled the constitutional process. And after that, there have been no big protest. Like people have
mm,
been demobilized, and after the election of the constitutional convention, there have been a systematic attack against the convention by the right wing media, by the government. Uh, Parliament is not helping very much to the process. So there's like a, let's say, a communicational operation to discredit the constitution. So it not so they can get rejection of the new constitution in the next year, because next year the constitution will be submitted to referendum to approve or reject the new constitution.
mm,
Now that is finished. So there have been this systematic attack, and a lot of people voted, for instance, for independence from social movements to be part of the convention, and they did really well in that election. But what happened is that for particular scandals of some of the members of the convention, the entire work of the convention has been discredited. I will put you an example. There was a guy called named Rodrigo Rojas. He was at every day in the protest in downtown Santiago, and he became known because he has cancer, and he was protesting because the right for free healthcare, etc. And people actually, you know, he became popular because of that, and many people voted for him. I voted for him for that reason, and it turns out that he never had cancer. It was all fake.
Oh my God, he was lying.
Yeah,
That's horrible.
yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah. And what happened is that this
What a
guy
scandal.
cannot resign from the convention, even if he wants, because the
Okay.
law was never, the people who made the law enabling the constitutional process never expected a constitutional member to resign from the convention.
Yeah.
So now you have the problem that people is saying why this guy is still being paid by the state, by public funds, to work in the convention if he is not working and he is lying, and you have this process and this kind of discussions every day. So there is like a systematic effort to discredit the convention, and sometimes the very people who are in are not helping really much
What a
to
dis what a
yeah,
disaster. And just for those who are listening and watching, this is the basically this referendum is all about rewriting the constitution that has not been rewritten since the 1980s under Pinochet.
yeah,
So that's an important task, and it makes sense that there would be this huge, likely corporate funded campaign to make sure it's not rewritten, because the way it's written is likely very good for global finance capital, I would imagine. I wanted to very
yeah,
briefly, before we kind of broaden out from Chile, I wanted to ask you about this issue that I've seen getting some coverage with there's like this indigenous rebellion taking place in Chile right now. I don't know if I'm saying this right. It's the Mapuches.
yeah,
Okay. So the Mapuches, who are the largest indigenous community in Chile, have reportedly staged this rebellion. They're reported to have been attacking forestry companies and
yeah.
large landowners. And your president, Sebastian Pinera, has declared a state of emergency as a result of this, and he's invoking, the issue of drug traffickers and violent crime. So can you very briefly explain, I guess, the conditions for indigenous people in Chile who we don't very often hear about? How does the Chilean public view the indigenous community, and why is this particular group fighting against the government right now? And
Yes.
lastly, sorry, this is like 5 questions in one, but also if you could speak to how, if this is playing out in the election discussion at all, or having any impact on the elections.
Yeah, let me start by saying that the Mapuche people are the largest indigenous group in this country. They are the biggest ethnic minority, if you want to put it that way. Um, and they live in the southern region of Chile, which is also the main area for the forest industry. You
Mm,
know, so what happened is that before the independence of Chile from the Spanish Empire, the Spanish crown recognized the autonomy of these indigenous communities in southern Chile.
mhm,
Then, after independence, the Chilean state recognized the autonomy of these indigenous communities. But then, in 1818, there was a process called the pacification of Araucania, which is the southern region in which these people live, which was a military invasion. So they invaded the Mapuche land to develop agriculture in the interest of the Chilean ruling class. Because maybe you don't know this, but Chile invaded Bolivia and Peru,
mm,
and we conquered the two provinces, one from Bolivia and one from Peru, and in that provinces are the biggest resources of Chile. At the first time, in the beginning, it was nitrate, and then was copper, and most of the Chilean workers went to work in the north, in the mines and fields of nitrate and copper. But then you need to, satisfy the demand for food for those workers. So after the conquest of the north, the Chilean military moved south and conquered the Mapuche land. And also that happened because if you saw a map of Chile, like Chile was sort of split because we, have a sovereignty and control over the far south, and then the rest of the country. So the Mapuche land was like an obstacle for the territorial continuity of the Chilean state. Something very similar happened in Argentina at the same time. So what happened is that people were deprived from their lands, and then the time passed by. Then we came to the Allende's government, in which there was land reform.
Mhm.
So land was expropriated from the landlords and landowners, and was give to peasants. Among those peasants, there was Mapuche people. I
Mm.
must stress that the Allende's government enacted this policy as a general policy for the Chilean population. It was not specifically designed for the Mapuche people, but they benefited from the land reform. Then during Pinochet, there was the counter land reform, in which many of these batches of land were taken back or restituted to the landlords, or sell to agribusiness companies and forestry companies. And then in the 90s, there was like an uprising of Mapuche identity. There was like a revival
Mm.
of indigenous identity in the south, and they start taking lands, like by force, let's say. Like they stage occupation, and they start establishing autonomous communities. And later on, there was some organizations who were engaging like armed violence
Mm.
for taking those lands, are attacking the objectives of or targeting forest industry, truck companies, etc. And you have this situation right now, in which there is like a state of permanent violence in the south, in the Araucanía region, in which there is like armed violence by the indigenous communities who want their land back. There is also violence from landowners who fund some paramilitary groups, and this is never acknowledged by the mainstream media, but this is known in the south. Like the landlords, they support paramilitary groups too. Then you have police special forces that have been operating there for, I don't know, 20 years or something, and now you have the military operating there,
Mm.
and that's the situation right now. And one of the characteristic or features of the Mapuche people is that they organize in a way that is very decentralized. So maybe you can capture a person from one organization, but you will not solve anything. In the 90s, there was an organization called Coordinadora Arauco Mayeco, and they disbanded their leadership by the state disbanded the group by prosecuting them. But now there is a lot of there is like six or five different insurgent groups operating in the south. Um, so that's the issue.
That's so interesting, and doesn't actually ever get really talked about. Although indigenous issues in general don't get any attention in the mainstream media across the Western Hemisphere. But I wanted to broaden the conversation out a little bit because you and I have also talked about this before. I wanted to talk about the issue of the US-China Cold War.
Yeah,
And China is, interestingly enough, despite Chile's very close relationship with the US, China is Chile's largest trading partner,
yeah.
which of course worries the US and Canada. And recently, this past summer, the Chinese firm Sinovac announced plans to invest $60 million to build a vaccine manufacturing plant in Santiago. Um, so, I mean, that's a really big deal. That just speaks to how close the partnership is between China and Chile when it comes to economic stuff. So, my question for you is, how is the US China Cold War playing out in Chile, if at all? And how is it reflected, or is it reflected at all, in the political divide in Chile?
This is very interesting. This is a very interesting issue, actually, because I must stress two things. First of all, the US is concerned about China's presence in Chile. They are.
Mm.
In 2 years ago, Mike Pompeo came to Chile specifically to bully Piñera not to do business with China and with Huawei, the telecommunications company. And at that moment, there was the discussion of implementing 5G in this country. And also, there was a project of building a submarine cable, like for optical fiber submarine cable, to connect the internet of Latin America with China through Chile. So there will be a cable going from Shanghai in China to Santiago, Chile, and then that cable will connect with Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and other countries. So that was a big project that was proposed by Huawei and the Chinese state. And Mike Pompeo came to Chile and bullied Piñera to say you shouldn't do that, because you will be doing business with a predatory empire, made ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, etc. And what happened after that is that the project of the cable was cancelled, and then a new project was developed to connect Chile with New Zealand and Australia. So if you see this from a geopolitical point of view, is having the communications of Chile with Asia under the control of the Five Eyes Alliance. This alliance between the U.S., Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the U.K. So that's a concrete example of how the Cold War is playing here. Also, another polemic we have here is that there was a licitation. I don't know if that's a proper English word, but leasing, I think that's a word, for doing the Chilean identification cards and the Chilean passports. So there was many companies offering to do that, and the better option for the Chilean state in terms of price and quality was a Chinese company called Icino. This company won this contest, and they will start producing our passports and ID cards in the next year. And the issue is that during that discussion, the U.S. ambassador, or I don't know, it was a U.S. representative, because I don't know if we had ambassador at that moment. We have now one, but there was like many years without U.S. ambassador here.
Maybe under Trump. Maybe under
Yeah,
Trump. There
yeah,
probably
yeah,
was. Yeah.
exactly. And they warned that if Chile accepted the offer of Icino, they will deprive us from the visa waiver agreement we have with the U.S., because we are the only country in Latin America that has that privilege. And of course, a lot of Chileans like to travel to the U.S., and they are afraid about that. For me, it's not a big issue, and I will be paying like a third less, or I will pay the passport price will go down 50%. So it's a big win for the average for every traveler, except for the ones that want to go to the U.S.
I see.
And then there's an issue with companies buying like strategic assets of the Chilean economy. So, for instance, there is a Chinese private company called Tianqi, which got 25% of the lithium company in Chile, which is private and owned by this son-in-law of Pinochet.
I
You know,
see. I see.
and also a Chinese state company got control of one of the second most important electricity provider of Chile. So they control electric distribution, and that of course have generated some like noise in Chile. But above all, that you have this kind of growing Chinese presence in the country. But in the terms of the political discussion, this will make it's not really surprising, but it is like this. Kast, the right-wing candidate, was asked about the relations of Chile with China, and he said, we will maintain our relations with China because it is
Really?
our number one trading partner, and we
Huh.
are not going to discuss politics with China. But then you have Gabriel Boric, which is the left-wing candidate, and he said, no, we will denounce the human rights violations of China because we will denounce human rights violations everywhere and blah, blah,
Uh,
blah, you know? So
Interesting. I'm
that's a big
actually
problem.
I'm actually surprised you say that just because you mentioned like Steve Bannon
Yeah,
being
yeah,
behind that network,
yeah,
and Steve Bannon
yeah,
is like so anti-China.
yeah. But you should
So I would
understand
have,
that
yeah.
like the Chilean oligarchy is totally on board with China. They are
Ah, because they
totally on
benefit.
board with China, and class interest is what decides in the end. So that's why Kast will support relations with China, and Boric
Uh-huh.
will be like not good in relations with China or anything like that, but he will probably have some sort of confrontation with the Chinese
Or at
about human
least,
rights or
right,
something.
he would essentially be kind of like supporting the US backed
Narrative, yeah,
propaganda against China,
no,
basically.
exactly.
Um, what a
And
what
oh,
a bizarre,
and
yeah,
what
go ahead.
and a last thing, there was a poll made by a right wing pollster like 3 years ago, and they asked who is your favorite or which world leader do you favor more, Donald Trump or Xi Jinping? And at that moment, Xi Jinping won by like 60% or something against I don't know 30% of Donald Trump. But after the pandemic, also, there is this
Oh,
conspiracy theories about the Chinese virus, and this is a Chinese plot to take over the world and control the global economy, etc. So there is now some sort of growing anti-China sentiment in the general population, but it won't go too far. It's like
interesting.
Chinese in Chile are not. There is a lot of Chinese malls in Chile, like small store companies, um, so they are everywhere, but I will say the Chinese community is very like reclusive, so they do not interact too much with the general population, so there is no like xenophobia like the one you see against I don't know, people from Haiti or from Venezuela or from Colombia.
That's so interesting. Like that's like a completely different dynamic that I can't really imagine because it's just so different in the US. But I do want to move to a country that is close to you, which is Peru. And I really do appreciate all the time you're giving me. I promise I don't have that many more questions, but it would be a shame not to talk about Peru because, next door you have Pedro Castillo, this former rural school teacher and farmer who won on a leftist platform in Peru to lift up the poor and nationalize various resource extraction industries in one of the most unequal countries in Latin America. So, to no one's surprise, there's been this right wing soft coup attempt against him. Can you explain what's happening in Peru? Who is the opposition to Castillo? And on what basis are they demanding he step down?
Yeah, so there is like something people should know about Peruvian politics. I'm not an expert on Peruvian politics, so I may be mistaken. But the problem is that they have like their politics is very fluid. So
Mm.
one day people will say A, and the next day they will say B. You know, and actually Pedro Castillo was not ahead in the polls. Like he's starting to upsurge just 2 weeks before the election, and there was like 15 presidential candidates. So there was Keiko Fujimori, which is the heir of of her father, Alberto Fujimori, which was a brutal and corrupt, let's say, dictator of Peru. He was not like technically a dictator, but he ruled as a dictator. And then you have other people like who were like Trump, like Peruvian versions of Trump. Then you have Peruvian versions of Bernie Sanders or Alexandra Ocasio, and then you have Pedro Castillo, who was a no
Mm.
one and who came ahead in the polls just before the election, and he passed to the second round. He was supported. He's still at certain point supported by a party called Peru Libre, Free Peru, which declared itself Marxist-Leninist. But Pedro Castillo was not a militant of that party until recently. He was chosen by the party. He was offered the candidacy ticket by the party. He ran and he won. And at the beginning, people from Peru Libre's party were represented mostly in the Castillo's cabinet.
Mm.
But then there was a very vicious attack by the media, by the oligarchy of Peru, and Mr. Castillo was forced to change the cabinet, essentially.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
problem is that Peru Libre, as a bloc in parliament, do not have the majority. And differently to Chile, in which it's pretty hard to remove a president, we have never done that like through a constitutional or an institutional process. We are having a impeachment process right now as we are speaking, and it will probably not go ahead in the Senate. It will pass
Mm,
the House, but it will not get. He will not be impeached by the Senate.
mm,
But in Peru, it's pretty easy to remove a president because there's the circumstantial coalitions of small parties that go against the incumbent president. They remove him. They force him to change cabinet, etc. So they have been moderating the cabinet of President Castillo, and he's like he has no real choice because he has no leverage in parliament.
yeah, if he doesn't have a majority coalition. And also, I've been watching these reports. God, the media on Latin America in English is so terrible. A lot of the reports in English about Chile and the migrants that are coming to Chile reference that there's people coming from Peru. And I don't know if this is true or not, but in the reports on Chile, the reporters will say, oh, like all these Peruvians are coming to Chile because they're escaping the terrible economy. The economy in Peru was great. And then Castillo became president like a few months ago, and now suddenly the economy
Yeah.
is tanking. Is that actually true?
No,
Like, what's that about? Is that
it,
just propaganda?
it's propaganda. I mean, I've never seen those reports, but I will say that in the 90s, Peruvian and Bolivian immigration was most of the migrant communities in Chile.
Mm,
So there was a moment in which Chile was the shining city of the hill in Latin America, and people from other countries, especially Bolivia and Peru, came to Chile to make fortunes and send remittance to their family in Peru or Bolivia. So they were most of the migrant community in the 90s, but that changed because Peruvian economy started to grow also, and they started returning. There is still a
mhm.
lot of Peruvians here, but I never hear about like an upsurge of Peruvian immigration after Castillo. I've just heard that Venezuelans are fleeing Peru
Mm.
and coming to Chile
Ah,
because of
okay.
Castillo. And I also hear that they are planning to go to the US if Boric is elected president here.
Jesus. I mean, it's just terrible how all this propaganda plays out because then, the thing is that people don't realize is sanctions work. Like ultimately, US sanctions work. The US completely tanked the Venezuelan economy. I'm not saying the Venezuelan government is completely blameless. I'm sure any government in this situation isn't going to know all the perfect decisions to make. And you're really screwed when the US completely sanctions your main industry, which is Venezuela's the oil industry. But for the average person, all they notice is like, okay, my living standards have gone down and now I need to leave because I can't get a job here. And they're going to blame whoever's in power. I
Yeah,
mean, that's the situation in Lebanon too. Like the economy's tanking and people will hear the media reports, the Western media
yeah,
reports or the Saudi media reports blaming Hezbollah. And then you'll just hear them repeat it. They're like, well, it's Hezbollah's fault. Like the economy's tanking. It's all Hezbollah's fault. And they end up just sanctions work, right?
yeah,
Um, but anyways, I wanted to move to you talked a little bit about Argentina and Argentina in like the US popular imagination is often like kind of like the way that Chile is perceived as being one of the better Latin American countries, like one of the more stable countries. Uh, and probably part of that has to do with racism too. But when it comes to Argentina, I mean, it's quite shocking the poverty numbers. It's over 40% of people in Argentina are living in poverty, which is really a
yeah.
shocking statistic. They've got crazy inflation, which they've been dealing with for years, which you and I were talking about before we started recording. And so you had mentioned far right, the rise of like this far right guy in Buenos Aires. So is there I wanted to ask you, is there any sort of leftist upsurge? Like, I feel like if the economy is doing poorly and you have all these people living in impoverished conditions, it's also yes, it's an opportunity for the right to rise, but
Yeah.
there also should be an opportunity there for the far left to arise. So you mentioned the far right. Is there any far left in Argentina that's also like in parallel rising amidst this
Yeah,
economic
that
disaster?
there is a problem in Argentina.
Mm.
Some people will say that's the greatness of Argentina, or some will say it's the curse of Argentina, which is Peronism. Peronism, the ideology of Juan Domingo Perón, which was a populist leader in Argentina in the 50s, and Peronism as is very vague. Is not very concrete in economic terms, and in ideological terms. So Peronism talks to the middle class, talks to the working class. It's against the oligarchy. It promotes workers' rights. It promotes industrialization. It's against the free market. But that was Peronism in its classical. It was Peronism when Peron was alive. So what happened after that is that Peronism is so big as a concept that you may have right-wing Peronism as Mr.
Hmm.
Menem in the 90s, that was like the poster child of the Washington Consensus in South America. And on the other hand, you have the Kirchners as a left-wing expression of Peronism. And then in the 70s, there was far-right Peronism with the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, and you have far-left Peronism, with the Montoneros organization. So the problem is in Argentina is that when it comes to like an alternative to Peronism, there is not. So the only way in which the left can grow is within the umbrella of Peronism, you know,
Oh.
and outside Peronism, there is only Trotskyism. And I think one of the few countries in which Trotskyism is a thing is Argentina, because they have people in parliament, they have people in local governments and stuff like that, and they have, I don't know where they get the money, but they usually send people to other Latin American countries like Chile to set up branches of their Trotskyist parties. uh, and there's like many Trotskyist parties in Argentina. So I think one of the biggest problems for the left is that there is no way to grow up outside the umbrella of Peronism. And
I see.
Peronism is so big, is a movement so big that in the same movement you have representatives of the working class, and at the same time you have big agribusiness or big businessmen, and they are all working together in this messy framework, you want to call
It's
it. So that's the problem. It's,
it sounds, I'm sorry, it sounds kind of like the Democratic Party. That's what there's the fluidity of that sort of like there's people on the left, but then there's also people on the right, but then there's also people in the center. Um, but so I think a good place to end on though, because like I don't want to just bash the left, because actually, you know, despite the ups and downs of the left and right in Latin America, as a whole, as a continent, it does seem like the only one of the only parts of the world where there is a left. And what I mean by that is
yeah,
I'm talking about, maybe not in Chile, the left isn't in power, but you have Cuba, you have Venezuela, you have Nicaragua, you have Bolivia, you have countries where the left, actually has captured power, is in power, is resisting not just on a like local domestic level, but even
yeah.
as an anti-imperialist left, which is really something to celebrate in so many ways. And the reason I mention that is because I'm sitting here in Beirut. I'm wishing there was even an Arab left that's like worth talking about, let alone capable of having any power. And as you know, like America, which I'm also American, America has a very divided and small left with really, no real actual power. So why do you think that the Latin American left, and I know that's a very umbrella term because obviously every country is
Yeah.
different, but why do you think that the left in Latin America that does have power, why do you think it has done as well as it has compared to the left in other parts of the world?
I mean, the left in Latin America has done well, but what I'm fearing, sorry to be so pessimistic, is that there is certain type of countries in which the left can be successful.
Mm.
And those are the countries that have a more, let's say, a more deep sense of identity. I won't necessarily national identity, but cultural identity, historical memory.
Mhm.
Countries like Bolivia, countries like Peru, even Peru, knowing that it's the first left wing government in Peru since, I don't know. There, in Peru, there was a socialist military junta in
Wow, I didn't
parallel
know
to
that.
Pinochet in Chile,
Oh.
and they made the land reform in the 70s. But so actually, the left is successful in countries that have some sort of social cohesion, that have been not so uh, eroded by neoliberalism,
Mhm.
and that's why they have been successful. Because the Cuban Revolution happened in the late 50s, and they are still there. The Venezuelan Revolution happened in the late 90s, just confronting the Washington Consensus. Same applies to Bolivia and other countries. Nicaragua had the Sandinista revolution before Ortega coming back to power. And in the case of Chile, for instance, the last left wing government we have was Allende, that
Mm.
was only 3 years in power. And then we have the dictatorship, and we came to resemble too much to the US in terms of, these fragmented identities. So people
Mm.
is, divided about gender, social movements, the environment, the animals, whatever, and actually it's like the identity of the working class as working class has been lost in this country.
Mm.
And
That's
I
yeah.
think that's the problem in many Latin American countries, is that neoliberal ideology has been so pervasive that you don't think in the terms the
Of
left
class.
should think about. You are forgetting about class, and not I am not even talking about being anti-imperialist.
Mm.
Many people here in Chile believe that imperialism is not even a thing. You know,
Like in
and
America.
yeah, and yeah, but America is the empire, so I have no problem with that. The problem is that us do not
Mm.
identify imperialism as imperialism, and we have the problem in the kind of our left. We have the problem that we look too much to the global north left experiences, like Podemos of
Interesting.
Spain, like Syriza of Greece, like the Democratic Socialists of the US, like the Labour parties in the UK, and you see those are all failures.
Yeah.
And we are looking at failures to try to do something good here, because the problem is that the elites of our left wing parties are not coming from the working class.
Mm.
They are middle class or upper class people who get access to college education, that got the scholarship, and they went to study at the US or at the UK or at France or Spain, and those are their ideological frameworks. So they have more in common, I don't know, with Bernie Sanders or Iglesias from Spain, than with Evo Morales or Lula or Correa.
That's so unfortunate just because it's like you're not
It's
learning
like
from
it's
the
like
left
it's like
in your own
cultural
neighbor.
colonization.
Yeah,
It's
we
like
have I mean yeah. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
it's,
I
it's
took
like
that
a
away.
cultural colonization of the left.
Yeah. That's a really good way to put it because I never thought about it like that. But that's so unfortunate is taking lessons from these global north like failed projects rather than learning from successful leftist movements that are literally your next door neighbors.
Yeah,
And that's I just want to touch on something you said about like cultural or like national identity as like some sort of cohesive identity for people to build around as well as a working class identity. And I think that's one of the reasons I think there's a parallel to be made about the Middle East is, I complain a lot about how the left here is almost non-existent. And a part of the part of the reason for that is they were never able to take their leftist ideology and create a form of it that worked with the local indigenous like cultural heritage and identity. And that's one thing that countries like, like it or not, like Iran has managed to build a sort of revolutionary movement and appeal around a certain um, around a certain cultural identity. And the same goes for a group like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've built their entire sort of revolutionary ideology around their base, around their sort of like Shia working class, former and still peasant community. And with Palestinians, it's like around the Palestinian identity. And so that I think you're really speaking to something important there about like when that doesn't exist, or when you don't, have that sort of identity for people to build a revolutionary ideology around it, it very quickly falls apart. On that note, Renato, thank you for giving me an hour and a half of your time. I really appreciate you coming down and breaking down Chilean politics and the far right and far left scene for us. I learned a lot.
Thanks to you. And I will be glad to come here again after the elections.
Yes, of course.
Because
Thank you so much.
There's a lot of things that will shock the world, honestly.
Yeah. We'll need to have you come on and break that down for us as well. Thank you so much, Renato.
Thank you.